when you start to shift into the New Testament, you get not only salvation from empire, which is the Roman Empire, you also start to get conversations about salvation from sin. Now, there are many reasons that scholarship says that this has made a shift. Part of it is after 100 or so years of Jesus not returning, salvation become a little less literal and a little more metaphorical. But you also start to realize that Jesus said a lot about the interior. So if you even go to the Sermon on the Mount, he says things that are quite interesting about the heart and the inside. And I also think it's just an amazing way for these gospel writers like Luke and his community. They're trying to expand the notion of salvation. They're trying to include Gentiles. And so the way to do that is they're just saying there are lots of people that need to be saved from all kinds of different reasons. And so it's not just like a political salvation. It certainly is that, but it's also a deeply personal thing. And that's the shift you begin to see in the New Testament. So it's being liberated from the external pharaohs in life, but it's also being liberated from the internal pharaohs in life. And so we've been kind of exploring this idea. And where we parked last week, which I went back and listened to my own sermon last week, and I need to apologize, all right? First of all, I talked way too fast, all right? And then second, all over the place last week, all right? And so I was possessed. Something happened. Some call it demons. I call it caffeine, all right? But I'm going to stick to the script today. We started last week and we talked about this lie of original sin, okay? Now, if you're new around here, most of us grew up evangelical, and so that's why we use the phrase post-evangelical reframing of salvation. And growing up evangelical, this is the Evangicube. If you haven't been here, we broke this thing out. And many of us were triggered and had to go to therapy the last couple weeks just because we were not ready for this, all right? But this is the Evangicube, and part of the reason I broke this out is because it kind of gives you an idea of how many of us were raised in understanding what salvation is. You heard that. I don't know of a phrase more triggering to me than every head bowed, every eye's closed, right? I mean, that thing just brings chills down my spine. And everything was centered around salvation. And the ultimate starting place for fundamentalists and evangelicals is right here. This is the start of the Evangicube block, which is you are inherently sinful. You are born broken. You are born flawed and ultimately separated from God. But here's the good news. You keep going through it. The problem is you're born sinful, but Jesus came. You've probably heard this story before, right? Jesus came to die for your sin, all right? Which is really interesting because you really didn't get this theory till later in life, but there was this thing called a substitutionary atonement theory, and the idea is that Jesus came almost as like a scapegoat to die for your sin because somebody had to appease God because God could not look upon sin, and God turned his back on sin because God is holy, and so Jesus came to be the bridge between that, right? And so that's the story I was handed. Probably likely close to the story you were handed. There's all kinds of things to say about substitutionary atonement theory. I will just say this to you because some of you are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. It's just best that you just keep it that way. Honestly, I was even reluctant to even talk about original sin because it dawned on me, many of you are so pure and amazing in here that you don't even know what original sin is. And the fact that I brought it up, now you're conscious of it and it is bothering you. And I'm like, I almost should have given like a little just, preface at the beginning going, if you've never heard of the phrase original sin, please leave now, all right? But for all of you that have been scarred by it, stick around, all right? So Jesus died, and then he was buried, he rose again, and here's what's great. Because of that, and this is what I want to talk about today, this step, he has made a bridge back to God, all right? Like that's the big thing. So he's made a bridge back to God, and so because of what Jesus has done, we can now be reunited with the divine. All right. What I want to do today is I want to get there. Now, we started with a fundamental, I believe, false starting place, which is you are inherently born broken and flawed. They call that original sin. If you weren't here last week, real fast, original sin is the doctrine that states all humans are born inherently broken and separated from God. And you don't have a choice in it. Original sin means it's passed down to you biologically. So by very nature of being born, you were born inherently sinful. Now, we are arguing this is a false starting place, okay? And the good news is we're not the first humans to say this is a false starting place. For those of you that are unfamiliar with church history, you just need to know it was only the western part of the world that ever embraced the idea of original sin. Last week, we walked through the history of it, where it came from, 2nd, 3rd century, the proof text that it came from, and then ultimately St. Augustine, who had his own problem of shame with his sexual encounters in life, and his understanding of his own shame with his sexual encounters, that he was the first to coin this phrase, original sin. So we walk through a lot of that. But ultimately, you need to know, all of the Eastern Orthodox world, they never believed or even interpreted Genesis 3 as a fall or there being an original sin at all right? And then don't even get me started on the Celtic tradition, which has, by and large, saved Western Christianity from its own demise by reminding us of the sacred nature of all things. Now, all of that said, what they called original sin, we've given language to it now looking back as post-evangelicals. We're looking back going, actually, we call that the ultimate childhood wound, okay? Because the ultimate child, so you have childhood wounds, which many of you are probably familiar with that. You've probably been to therapy and worked through your own childhood wounds. You have your childhood wounds, but then you have the ultimate childhood wound. And the ultimate childhood wound is the lie that you were born with a childhood wound, okay? And so we went as far as to say, and we tried to be as loud as we could on socials this week, all right, to say the lie of original sin is the root of all evil. That's a strong statement, and we understand how strong that is. Hear me when I say this. I think the lie of original sin is the root of all evil. And what I mean by that is this. If you take any act of dehumanization, what you will find is it comes from the delusion that whatever individual, whoever the individual is doing the act, has been disillusioned to believe they are something other than sacred and divine. So the reason we're so adamant and passionate about this idea of eliminating original sin is because I don't think evangelicals ever dreamed of the damage this one idea has actually done to the human species. And there's lots of reasons why, but you just need to know this. At its core, actions flow from essence. And so if you keep telling people they're inherently broken, you better believe the actions will match that belief. And beyond that, we recognize that there's a whole world of Christians all throughout history that said, where did that idea come from? Oh, St. Augustine. Oh, he was dealing with his own stuff. He had major influence over much of Christianity. And you begin to realize this isn't just some doctrine that you can choose to believe or not believe. The very idea is actually something that has altered the course of the human species. And so when I stand up and share these ideas, I just want you to know they come from a place that this is what my hope is for Vinings Lake. It's like, what are we about? My hope is that we are about, at its very core, this one thing, letting people know, reminding them, helping them wake up to their true fundamental essence, the deepest part of who they are, is, according to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, actually made in the image of God. And the divine voice looked at it and said, it's very good. And this must be our starting place. This isn't a negation of sin, but sin is not the first word spoken about us, and it's not the last word spoken about us. So we have to get our starting place right. Now, evangelicals love the starting place of original sin because turns out they have the solution to original sin. And it's very profitable. And so to remove step one of original sin is essentially to wipe away the entire business model of the evangelical world. And so it's like, let's put our death grip on this because we cannot lose this. Otherwise, we have nothing to offer. But what we learned last week, too, is that this came about, this idea, around the 4th century, which was when You had the Jesus followers at the time, the Christians, and the Roman Empire coming together. They were merging their powers. And isn't that fortuitous, right? Because I got to tell you, a good way to run the world is to let them know they cannot trust themselves. That ultimately, when we talk about original sin, you're talking about power. It's creating codependency. And I'm telling you, you got to see this. This is why it's important. This is why I try to give you the best theological education as possible here, all right? Because I want you to know when you show up at a table. I want you to know when you go to Easter this week and that your grandfather, your uncle is going to say something. I want you to have a little bit to stand on, a little bit of ground to be like, well, let's back that up a little bit, all right? So what I want to do today is I want to go to one of their proof texts. Last week, we just opened it up. This week, I want to get right into it. It's Genesis 3. Now, I want to say this to all of you, okay? It is 11:40 on my clock. Okay? Don't look at your clock again. Don't worry about it. If you're here and you have kids, think of it this way. Even if you get bored right now, just think of it. This is free daycare for you right now. So let the kids be. Let the kids be. If you need to jump on Instagram, you have to do your thing, all right? I have things I need to say this morning, and I want to be very clear about it. I'm going somewhere, and I'm going to go really fast, and I have a lot of quotes and a lot of info to give you. And so if I don't pause every now and then and make you laugh, just know that's not the norm around here, but I've got an agenda today, all right? So it's less laughs and more info. So I'm going to load you down. Snap screenshots if you want. If you need my notes, you let me know, all right? But I'm going to give it to you as much as I can because there's a lot of ground to cover. But let's just do this. Let's start here. Here's like the ultimate proof text for original sin. It's found in Genesis chapter 3. We'll pick up in verse 1. I do not have time to read that whole story, so I'm going to cut parts out because I want to get to the right part. That does not mean I'm liberal and I'm just like cutting out parts of the Bible that I disagree with, all right? I have to say that because if you're like, you missed verse 4. Is that where the divine says original sin? Okay, no, you cannot actually find it in this story. You cannot find it in the Bible. It's nowhere in there. And I'm okay if you're here going, I still firmly believe in original sin. Okay, just admit that you implanted it in the Bible because it's actually not in there. Okay, Genesis 3, verse 1. Now, the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you will die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both them were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Then they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called out to the man and said, "I'm walking away and separating from you because of your sin." Did y'all see that? I don't think that's, I was just implanting, but y'all were so into the reading, you just missed it. I'm implanting. Not one gasp in here. Everybody's just like, yep, makes sense. Then they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees in the garden. But the Lord God called out to the man and said to him, what a profound question. Where are you? Where are you? And he said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked and I hid myself. And he said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? And the man said, the woman, man, it never fails. I've been reading this text for years, and I still laugh when I get to that. Verse 12. I mean, it's not on par for the man. It is just on par. And the man said, the woman you gave me to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree and I ate. God, we're always culpable disturbance of shalom. One writer said that's how they define sin. What is sin? Culpable disturbance of shalom. And that culpability means owning your part of it. Obviously, Adam doesn't. He shifts the blame. Arguably, I would say that's the problem. One of the problems with original sin is if you buy into original sin, then what you're really doing is you're not owning up to your own part of it because you're saying that's your excuse. You're saying, I can't help it. It's just I was just born this way. I'm only human, right? And so he blames it on the woman. Verse 13, then the Lord God said to the woman, what is this you have done? And the woman said, the serpent tricked me, and I ate. Now, at this point in the story, he goes through a list of curses, okay? I need to say this about the curses because I don't have time to give like a full exegesis on this. A couple of things about the curses. One, quote me on this. Nowhere in the story does God curse Adam and Eve. Nowhere. Read it again. Nowhere does God curse Adam and Eve. What you see, God curses the serpent and God curses the ground on which they walk. But you do not find a curse with Adam and Eve, okay? Now, we'll get into a little bit of that, hopefully if we have time, okay? But that's just a point to make. I understand the curses as more of a description than prescription. This is what I believe these writers are writing going, let me show you the consequences of their actions now, okay? Now, goes through those curses, but I had to show you this. After the curses, verse 20, it picks up and it says this. After all this, the man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made garments of skins for the man and for his wife and clothed them. Okay, how about a reframing of this story for a minute, all right? There's 1,000 ways to read this text. A couple years ago, I did a whole series called In the Beginning, and we read it one way. I have read this text 1,000 different ways. There's 1,000 different interpretations I could give you of this. Just last week, you probably don't know David and Maria. They're sitting back there, but they are new around here. And we went to table last week, and we're the last four standing around. And within 1 second, David spit out an interpretation of Genesis 3 that I was like, you're speaking next Sunday, all right? Brand new around here. But it was mind-blowing. I mean, it was unbelievable. He gave an interpretation to say, yeah, ever consider this? What if, like, Adam was like an image or symbol of consciousness? And what if Eve was like the subconscious because Eve came out of Adam, so the subconscious comes out of the conscious? And then what if the serpent is more like, the ego? And I'm like, oh my God. Then you start toying around with those images and you're like, that's the most mind-blowing thing I ever heard. Because you do know when these writers are writing in the ancient Near East, they don't have language like consciousness or conscious and subconscious. You know what I mean? The ego wasn't a thing back then. So if you're trying to describe something like that, it would be brilliant and creative to like put it in the form of a talking snake, right? So I'm just giving you an example. That's just from someone who's coming to VL 3 weeks. The level of theological education we have in this building, all right, is mind-blowing, all right? So I'm telling you, if you've read this, but I heard it this way. But yes, of course you did. I mean, by and large, most of us grew up evangelical. Is there a more popular text in the evangelical world than Genesis 3? And so I know what I'm up against when I'm trying to help reshape and reframe a little bit of this thinking. But what I'd like to do is just introduce you to the Eastern Christianity. That's what I like. That's all I'm going to do today. I'd like to introduce you to the other half of the world that doesn't read it as a fall. You know what they read it as? They read it as a rising, not a falling. They read it as an awakening. So it's not about falling down. It's about waking up. And this is why he keeps repeating that phrase, and the eyes of them were open. Says it twice. What does that mean? They were walking around with their eyes closed? You see, it's like the writers are trying to get at some level of consciousness here. The eyes of them were open. What does that mean? They experienced an awakening. All right? So that's where we're headed. Now, let me give you something that may really help you just from the start of Genesis 3, if just kind of put a 30,000-foot view on it for a minute. Now, this comes from a friend of ours at Vinings Lake's been here several times, called Pete Enns. Pete Enns started the Bible for Normal People. He's come and spoke here a couple times. We'll have him back here again soon. One of my favorite humans. But Pete Enns reads Genesis 3 as a preview of Israel's history. Okay? Now, if you're like, what do you mean by that? All right? Remember, these writings were edited and redacted and put together after the exile, right? So they look back and they start asking questions. How did we get here? We're coming out of exile. They're recording all of these stories that have passed down. How did we get here? And so they start writing this. So Pete N says it makes logical sense that they're reflecting on their life and they're going, what if we could create like a micro story about the macro story of the Israelites? Now, if you're going, wait a minute, I'm a little confused. Maybe this will help you. Think of Genesis 3 as a preview of Israel's history. It's the story of Israel as God's people. Now, think about this. Adam was created by God, exiled from paradise for disobeying a command. Israel was created by God, Genesis 1, exiled from the promised land, Canaan, for disobeying the commandments. All right, do you see the comparison between the two? Now, Enns went on to write this. This will not be on the screen because I just inserted it this morning. All right? Knowing the difference between good and evil is the point of the law in the Old Testament. All right? You're here and you're like, yeah, I agree with that. If you read the Old Testament, by and large, a lot of it is knowing the difference between good and evil. What is this tree called? The knowledge of good and evil. And most scholarship says this is actually wisdom literature. It's all about wisdom in this text, all right? The law given to Moses at Mount Sinai tells Israel what is good and what is evil. And if they obeyed what the law says, it went well with them, which we already saw means that they would be able to stay in the promised land. If they disobeyed, it would lead to consequences, ultimately exile from the promised land. This is the big choice Israel faces throughout its history. Obey the law and be blessed with land, disobey and forfeit the land. Now, from that perspective, do you see how these writers would be like, let's take our story of our ancestors and let's just whittle it down to Genesis 3, that maybe they can get a preview of what the rest of the Old Testament is actually going to be about. Now, all of that said, let's get into it. 3 things. 1, I just want to talk to you about the serpent for a second. Then I want to talk to you about sin. We're going to define sin this morning. Cannot wait. All right? Can't wait to get there. Because some of you are like, yeah, because I've had many of you, Cody, do you think this is a sin? What I love about our community is y'all stopped asking that years ago. And I love that. That either means you stop caring and you just sin like crazy, or you have graduated to a theological level where you're like, oh, I think I understand maybe what sin is, right? So we're going to define sin. And then today, I'm going to give you, for the first time in this series, a post-evangelical understanding of salvation, all right? Of salvation. Now, let's talk about the serpent for just a second here. This talking snake. This talking snake says something really interesting that I want to bring to our attention. What did God say to you about the tree? Essentially is the question the serpent poses. But the serpent says something really clever. No, it's not that God doesn't want you to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil because that's just a commandment he gives you, because God's some legalistic God up there saying you can do this, you can't do this. Out of the serpent's mouth, it actually says, the divine knows that if you eat it, you will become like God. Implied within this temptation is the belief that God is not who God says God is. Implied within this temptation is the belief that Adam and Eve aren't who God says they are. Think about the crux of the question. If you eat it, God knows that you will become like God. Implied within that is a belief that they are not already like God. Well, let's just pause there for a minute. Is that not still true for us today? This crafty serpent, who is not Satan in the narrative, by the way, another interpretation that by and large is missed. But what you have is this talking snake, and immediately at the very beginning of the story, it's like these Israelites are going, let me explain to you how our story got off track a little bit. Here's how it started. Somewhere along the way, we began to believe that we were not like God. Somewhere along the way, we begin to believe that God wasn't who God said God was, and that we weren't who God said we were. And somewhere along the way, we began to actually believe that God was holding out on us. That maybe God didn't want us to do this, not because it's actually for human flourishing, but maybe God didn't want us to do this because ultimately, like, God was a little bit terrified because God knew if we did do this, then we would become just as powerful as God is. And implicit within that is this idea that they are not already like God. So check this out. Genesis 1 you are made in the image of God. God blesses them, says it's very good. Genesis 2, they're made from the ground, this sacred dust. God breathes into them this life. And then immediately what you have in this sacred creation narrative, right at the very beginning, the origin of the story, is a whisper. It is a lie. And isn't that how it goes? We have this inner wisdom intuitively within us that we belong to God. I am not here to try to persuade you of what to believe this morning. I am here in some sense to help wake you up to what you already intuitively know within you. And this is why when you share stuff like this, some of you would come along and be like, my God, thank you for saying it. It's like I knew it, but I just never heard it said like that. Yes, it's already within you. It's a deep well of wisdom within you. You know, if you held an infant, a newborn baby. Haley was sitting over here in the corner a little while ago, and I walked over, and their newborn, Taylor and him's newborn, Miller Lake, and I just reached down. Do you think for 1 second I reached down, touched her hand, and was like, you sinner? Do you know? Now, I'm not their parents, and maybe Taylor in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. is like, I believe in original sin, all right? Yeah, I like that. I have to tell you, too, there are people who arguably almost convince me original sin is real. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where I'm like, we got to have original sin. But you cannot hold an infant and not intuitively know within you that there is something deeply sacred about this. Yeah, it's like we know. But yet somewhere as we started growing up and getting older, we began to believe a lie as if the universe or the accusing voices within us just says, hey, do you want to be like God? And we didn't even think about it. We're like, yeah, we want to be like God. Well, I wouldn't want to be like God. But by believing that, we believe we weren't already like God. But we're made in the image of God. And then you have in this moment right here just a break in the conversation to say, actually, if you want to be made in the image of God, then eat of this tree. And so what do the humans do? These are stand-in metaphors. Adam and Eve. What do? They took and they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, a couple thoughts here. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is it wrong? That's just plain cursory reading. The tree of the knowledge of good. So would you say, wait, good and evil, like the knowledge of good and evil is wrong? I'm grateful for the knowledge of good and evil. How about you? I'm grateful that I can cut on my TV and go, that's wrong. Do you know what I mean? I'm grateful for that. I am grateful I was raised in a house where, just like in the law, they helped me in my early infant stages. They helped show me good and evil. I didn't know. Now, they did it in ways that I'm like, we should probably talk about it. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if the end of the leather belt was the best thing to hit a child with. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I know some of you, and you're very passionate about raising children and all that, and you're like, that's abuse, all right? I'm here. I just want you to know that, all right? And I just want you to know, there were moments where I would do things. I remember I would do things, and I would come home, and ultimately my mom would just say, your dad's on his way. And that was my fundamental understanding of what God was like, honestly. Be like, well, and I still believed it for years, like people think they're getting by with stuff, but one day Dad's coming home. You know what I'm talking about? And that was like the rapture and the end of the world, and God's going to come, and God's going to lay down, and he's going to have a big beard, and he's going to pull off a big, huge leather belt and be like, I know you lusted over that girl in 8th grade. Come here, right? Like, and this is the idea, right? It's like this is our understandings of how God operates. But here's the truth. Knowing good and evil, that's a good thing. By the way, if you've ever read the wisdom literature in the Bible, the book of Proverbs is all about discerning between good and evil. So maybe we could just say this. This is a necessary part of development. So maybe, just go with me here, I'm giving you an interpretation. Maybe the command to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not a matter of God saying never eat. You don't see that in the Bible. Nowhere in the Bible does it say never eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Maybe it's not a matter of God saying never, but maybe it's about God saying not right now. Maybe this is a story about trusting God's path to human flourishing. And maybe what you have is Adam and Eve, just like the Israelites in their story, because it's a microcosm, maybe they're just trying to take a shortcut here. But that's not how growth works. I wish you could just flip a switch. Be like, well, look at you. You're so immature. Hold on, I got you. Boom. Maturity. Wisdom. No. You can't think switches. You got to think seeds, right? That's how it works. If you've ever raised a child, you know how human development works. I think this is the story we're reading in the moment. The command is not a matter of God saying never. It's just about saying not now. The whole crux of the story of the Old Testament is about, will these Israelites have faith, translation, trust, the divine is leading them into human flourishing. Okay? Now, all of that said, we could play with these images all day long. I heard one writer say, yeah, he thought, because you have two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One writer understood the tree of life to be like an umbilical cord, and that what happened is that they prematurely cut that umbilical cord, and they tried to take a shortcut, and it just didn't work. And so the whole point of Eden is you keep trying to come back to that source of life. But in some ways, it's like been severed there. And this is where you have what most evangelicals would call the first understanding of sin. Disobedience to God. Now, let me say a couple things. The actual word sin doesn't appear till the next chapter, when Cain and Abel have their thing and murder happens. So violence is actually the first time that you see the word sin. But a lot of evangelicals say this is where it started. And then some even say that the actual behavior of disobeying the command and then the consequences of that behavior is what you have in the curses. Now, let's talk about sin for just a minute. Sin is a word that has been greatly misunderstood and misinterpreted. Even saying the word sin, there's some of you in here that cringe a little bit. Maybe some of you are even triggered by it. I get that. Some of you are like, I washed it away from my vocabulary. My kids and I don't talk about sin at all. I have an acquaintance. We'll probably get him here one day, but his name is Michael Gungor, and they used to do a podcast called The Liturgist, and we had a conversation on the phone not that long ago, because I was going to try to get him out here, and things just didn't work out, but we'll try to get him out here again. But he said something that I thought was really interesting, because I want to throw you a couple of just working definitions of sin for just a minute. But I saw him tweet this interesting, and I thought this was really good, because he's raising kids, and he's like, what happens if your kids come to you and they want to talk to you about sin? What do you say, right? And I thought this was so great. He said, thank you for caring about this. He said, I haven't used the concept of, quote, sin at all in my parenting personally. But if they were asking about sin, I think I would say that sin is a way of describing the things that we do that make us feel separated from God, each other, and ourselves. I really like that. I really like that. So I kind of wrote my own version here. Head nod to Gungor. Sin is a way to describe the things we do that make us feel other than beloved. All right? Now, let me get to how I understand that working definition. The Greek word that's oftentimes translated for sin is the word hamartia. All right? Now, hang with me. I know school is in session. Hang with me, all right? This is worth your theological education. Hamartia. Now, I know you're not going to sit at the Easter table and someone comes down and start throwing down original sin and you're like, hamartia, all right? Like, I know, I'm fully aware you're probably not throwing that Greek word down. But if you want to impress your people, write that Greek word down, okay? Hamartia. Now, this isn't going to be on the screen. Hang with me. Hamartia is the often where we get the word sin. It's the Greek word that's translated into sin that we use most often, all right? Now, hamartia is actually an archery term, all right? And you've probably heard this. Hang with me because it's going to trigger something. But you've heard this phrase, archery term, meaning you miss the... Okay. Oh, God, did you feel it? I felt it. All right. Here's the problem. Hamartia is actually two phrases. I want to get into this for a second. Ha, that H-A, is a negation. So let me give you an example. If you use the word unknown, what is the un? It's unknown. Un is a negation. It's a negation of none. All right? So think about hamartia. Ha is also a negation. And then you have this word martia, which comes from the Greek root meros, which means form, origin, or being. I need to head nod Sir William Paul Young, okay? So the fundamental meaning of sin is negation of being. Missing the mark is accurate. But I want to be very clear. The mark is not moral behavior. The mark is the truth of our being. God, I hope you get that. Sin is a word that has been greatly misunderstood and misinterpreted because sin is not missing the mark of moral behavior. Sin is missing the mark of the truth of our own being. It is a negation. It are the things we do that negate our own essence. It is the actions we do that betray our own original goodness. So we can say what was on the screen, sin is a way to describe anything that makes us feel other than what the divine has told us is true about us. William Paul Young said it this way. He said, what if sin isn't fundamentally about behavior but something deeper? What if it is so deep that all the behavior modification and moralistic performance won't even begin to address it? What if our focus on behavior is an attempt to treat the symptoms and distract us from attending to the actual disease? And maybe that disease is that, again, we have failed to or forgotten the truth of our own being, that God said it's good to be human. Underneath all the contradictions, underneath all the complexities, underneath all of the ways in which you failed to recognize your own essence, at the very surface level, the divine has called good. And I don't believe God has changed God's mind on that. The great Eckhart Tolle. Y'all know him? I like saying it like that. Tolle. Eckhart has wrecked my world in all the right ways over the years. His book, A New Earth, single-handedly outside of the Bible, one of the greatest books ever written in human civilization. Eckhart Tolle said it so well. Here's a great way to word it. He said, there is only one perpetrator of evil, and that's human unconsciousness. What a word. Everything I've tried to say in all my sermons, he summed up in one sentence. There is only one perpetrator of evil, and it's human unconsciousness. What does he mean by that? I think there are lots of ways to look at this. But if you think about it, every vile act that we might call evil comes from someone who's not conscious, comes from someone who's unconscious. And what we mean is it comes from someone who's unconscious of their own inherent goodness. And this is why we say with authority, the lie of original sin is the root of all evil. Because all acts of dehumanization stem from this idea that somebody somewhere had a moment of unconsciousness and they weren't aware that their very essence is deeply sacred, and they weren't aware that the very thing that they're about to kill is also deeply sacred. They were unconscious. And this is the very fundamental understanding and definition of sin. Missing the mark, but the mark is not moral perfection. The mark is the truth of your being. Now, what happens? They miss the mark of the truth of their own being. They begin to believe the lie of the talking snake, that they are not already like God. And so in an attempt to try to be like God, what do? They add something. That's how it always works. Can I give you another quote? I'm telling you, we're going to quote it out today. Meister Eckhart, the great mystic Meister Eckhart, said, yep, God is to be found in the human soul, not by addition, but by subtraction. Now, I know some of you here are going, unpack that. Nope. Not going to do it. Going to leave that right there. But I do hope you let it sink in on you today. Addition by addition. That's how we always try to. I got to be like God, so let me add this. Let me add this. Meister Eckhart says, no, you're doing the thing wrong. Subtract. God, that's deep, and it's good. So what happens? Adam and Eve, they miss the mark. They have a moment of unconsciousness. They have forgotten that who they are is deeply sacred. They began to believe the lie that they are something other than made of God. And immediately, what do they experience? Check this out. Shame. Did you notice that? It's in the story. Shame. What do? They immediately hide. Because here's the thing with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's good to know the difference between good and evil, but when you're not ready for that yet, this story, when you take the shortcut, what begins to happen is you begin to believe good and evil is not just like what is good and evil. You begin to believe that good and evil now is about who is good and evil. And when you begin to make a distinction between what is good and evil and who is good and evil, you begin to now make judgmental calls on this person is good, this person is evil. This person is good, this person is evil. And that's a little challenging because where is the scale and how do we judge? I just this week watched Masters of the Air. It's on Apple. I don't really watch war movies because, well, I'm a Jesus follower. And no offense to anyone in here that has been in the military, all right? I'm going to leave that conversation for Shane Claiborne, all right? He'll be back sometime, and he'll just wear it all out, and then he leaves, and I clean up the mess, all right? But I really like this actor in there. He's played Elvis. He's just like, he's an amazing actor. And I watched this, and, it was really hard, World War II, watching this. It's like 9 episodes, just one season, and got to the end, and sure enough, a little bit of a tear in the corner, but I'm not going to cry at a war movie, and Katie was right next door, and I'm like, I'm good. But you start thinking about Nazi Germany and Hitler, and I know this is Gothlaw's Law. It's easy. Gothlaw's Law is just like, always insert the Hitler conversation because he's the ultimate. But it would be easy for us to look at that and say, oh, it's very clear Hitler was an evil man. But then I just have to ask the question, at what point did he become an evil man? After the first killing? Or the second? Or the millionth? And then at what point did you get to define yourself as good? Was that because you're here on Palm Sunday and not just Easter? You know what I'm saying? Because you did pay it forward in the Starbucks line? Look, I'm good. Hitler never paid for someone's coffee. I'm good. Do you see what I'm saying? Like when you get on that performance wheel, it's really hard to start making calls like who's good and who's... But this is what happens in this story. You get in this story now, and all of a sudden it's no longer what is good and what is evil, which I think are necessary terms that we still need to bring with us as we evolve. I think we have strong terms for a reason, okay? Because even in the church world, there are times that word is necessary. I mean, even this week, I keep hearing about things, and I don't like to bring up bad laundry in churches, but I'm just saying, like you cannot sexually assault people in the power of your Jesus and no one step up and say, that is evil. Those are why those words are there. Do you understand that? But when you start making the shift and you start saying, actually, your actions define your essence, therein is the problem in the story. And so they begin to believe, check this out, they messed up, so now they are inherently evil. And what happens when you begin to? Shame. Shame. And so the text says that all of a sudden, I love this, God comes in the cool of the day. I think it's like a King James phrase, cool of the day. And he starts to go, where are you? Well, first of all, I'm pretty sure like the God character would know where they are. So it's almost like the God character's toying with them. You ever played hide and seek with your kids or nieces or nephews? Where are you? But you know they're like right there in the closet. You know what I'm talking about? Where are you? Where are you? It's a profound question we're going to get to in a second. Where are you? And God says, where are you? And then they say, we were hiding. Well, why would you hide? Because you're ashamed. So what you have in this story is this shame. And head nod to Brene Brown. She taught us this years ago. Guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am something wrong. And that is the ultimate understanding of original sin. But here's what's so interesting. Did you know in chapter 2, verse 25, the text says they were naked and not ashamed? So right before Genesis 3, the text says, 2:25, they were naked and not ashamed. Now they're naked and ashamed. So at one point, there's a way to live where you understand you're deeply connected and tied to original goodness, and you can walk around and you're not ashamed. And then the moment this happens, they begin to believe that they themselves are evil. And then the text says there is shame. But I want to stop on this question, and then we wind it down right here with what God did in response. Y'all have done really well so far. I mean, honestly, this is a lot of information, but you're in it, and I just feel like it's gone great today. All right? Okay. Here's the question. Think about this. Meditate on this week, and then interpret it however you want. But the divine voice comes into the garden and says, where are you? Where are you? I have not stopped thinking about that question. Where are you? Where are you? Where are you in relation to what we're talking about this morning? Where are you? Where are you in your relationship with ultimacy? Where are you with your relationship to the divine? Where are you with relationship to God? Whatever metaphor you want to use. Where are you in relationship in your own spirituality? Where are you? John Philip Newell, the great voice of the Celtic tradition in our time, said this. This will be on the screen. Adam and Eve have become false to themselves and to the one who is at the heart of the garden. They are hiding and have covered the nakedness of their being. Think about that. God says to them, where are you? Erigena adds that God is forever walking in the garden of our beings, asking why we are hiding, why we are covering our nature, why we are living at a distance from our truest origin. From the genesis of our soul, he says, God is asking, where are you? Where are we as individuals today? Where are we as an earth community? Are we in hiding from our true nature and from the deepest notes of life's garden? Are we cutting ourselves off from the voice that still sounds from Eden, inviting us to respond to our name, our deepest identity, Adam of the ground, Eve, womb of life? What a profound question. Maybe that's one way to look at it. Maybe one way for us to see is that they are hiding and have covered the truth of their own being. And the question is profound. Where are you? Because what I want to say is wherever you are this morning, maybe in some way we can all get back to Eden. If we understand Eden to be the deepest essence of who we are. And this is my hope for the city of Atlanta. It's my hope for all of you. If I never gave another sermon and this was the last thing, Cody, give me one last word, what you got, it would be this. Eden is still here. It's still present. I believe it represents the deepest essence of your identity, and I'm telling you, you can return at any time. And whether you believe that's true or don't believe that's true, it's still true that you are made inherently in the image of God. And God saw it was good. And God blessed it. Now, let me tell you what you don't see right here. You do not see God entering the garden and God turning his back and saying, you messed up, you sinned, I'm out. You don't even see God coming in here with a sense of anger and wrath with the belt going, bend over, Adam. Now you're going to have to be disciplined. And here it is. Even the curses are not to Adam and Eve, but what they are is inevitably consequences of missing that mark of the truth of their own being. Let me just read this. It won't be on the screen as well, but we got to say it. Let's just throw it all out here. Pete Enns said this: what is missing among the list of punishments, curses, is what many Christians think is the whole point of the story, inheriting a sinful state, meaning being born into an inherited state of sinfulness and guilt before God. This story, in other words, is thought to answer the ultimate question. Where did sin come from, Pastor? Why are we sinful? But it doesn't. It describes an act of sinfulness and disobedience, but there is no moral to this story here or anywhere in the Old Testament. And this, folks, is why we are born into a helpless state of guilt and condemnation before God, evangelicals say. But let me be clear. The Bible, both Testaments, speak clearly about the reality of sin. Again, I'm not denying sin. But the Bible doesn't explain where sin came from, which has fueled endless theological and philosophical speculation. We should also take note of a point commonly raised at this juncture. Here's one for you. If the sin of Adam and Eve is the cause of an inherited sinfulness for all humans, then answer this for me. Where did the sinfulness come from that led Adam and Eve to disobey in the first place? I don't think you caught that. I'll say it again. If the sin of Adam and Eve is the cause of an inherited sinfulness for all humans, then where did the sinfulness come from that led Adam and Eve to disobey in the first place? Game, set, match. If you're looking for a debate, you just won. I hope your crafty snake egos feel good. All right? Now, look at God's response, and then we're out. What does God do in the story? God's first action is not to turn away from them, but to turn toward them. The divine doesn't run away or separate himself. The divine actually moves closer. And the narrative says that the divine actually helps cover, he provides for them and helps cover their own shame. God doesn't stand and judge them. God doesn't mock their shame. God doesn't even increase their shame. God tries to provide some way to cover their own shame. And so this is the good news about Genesis 3. We are not and have never been separated from the divine. The problem is not separation from God. The problem is the lie that you and I have ever been separated from God. You are not born broken and opposed to God. The good news is much better than all of that. You are born whole and inherently united with God. This, my friends, is what I call the gospel, the good news. And I laugh at myself. It's 2024. We're some of the most progressive people. Yeah, you can clap, okay? We're some of the most progressive people in Atlanta, I'm told. And we're still talking about the gospel, all right? But we certainly mean different things when we say it. But I actually believe this is the best news ever. And so if that's true, then we just need to say this. This whole language, first of all, step one, the root of all evil. Step 4 or 5, whatever this is. I think it's time to burn that bridge. Burn that bridge that Jesus made a way for us to get to God. Can we just burn that whole bridge down? Because here's the thing. Jesus did not come to build a bridge back to God because, newsflash, there is nothing outside of God. There was never a necessity for a bridge. Because the truth is, you've never been separated from God. And Jesus came not to build a bridge back to God. Jesus came to show you that you have always been one with the Father. John 10 is the perfect example. I am in you, you are in me. We are all in this. We are inherently united with God. And so if that is true, here's our working post-evangelical definition of salvation. If you want to continue to hang on to the paradigm of saved. First of all, let's say it like this. If we hang on to the paradigm, it's time we stop using salvation as a description of people's essence and more as a description for their own actions. Here's what I mean. We are in no place to be like Adam and Eve to make calls. Lost, saved. Lost, saved. Good, evil. Hang with me. If you're talking about actions, wonderful. If you're talking about essence, you miss the mark. And so, for some of you, you just need to lay down the whole paradigms of lost and saved. Others of you are like, I can't lay it down because if you understand it in its original context, it's always been about oppression and actual liberation. Yes, so hang on to that because in some ways, we still need the language of lost and saved, but what we mean by that is totally different than how we were raised. So when we talk about salvation, we're talking about it as an act of actual liberation, like literal, concrete liberation. Yes, those people have been saved. Beautiful. But if we start shifting it and doing what evangelicals have done for years, which is that person is saved, that person is, we have now created categories of who's in and who's out. And I don't know how to tell you this, but check it out. Nobody's out. You're all in. Good. And I know some of you are going, well, I don't want to be in. So if this is true, then maybe we could say it like this. If you want to bring salvation along with you, and if you're hearing like, I'm done with it, great. You're in. We're all in. The whole human species is in. The whole thing's in. But if you're hearing like, but I still need a little language to it, metaphorically speaking, here's where I've landed on it. Then maybe we could say, salvation is waking up to who we already are, who we have always been, and what we somehow unconsciously have always known, that we are beloved children of God. And so when I meet people and just say, I just had an epiphany. You were just saved. One day, I was like on this journey. I grew up evangelical. I was on this journey. And then all of a sudden, I Googled Vinings Lake. I showed up and you started talking about original goodness. And no one's ever said that to me before. And it was just like, oh my God, intuitively I knew, of course this is true. Welcome. You have experienced an awakening. And I want you to know, if you never experienced the awakening or your parents never experienced the awakening, it doesn't mean it's less true. They are also all too children of God. But I will say this, isn't it nice to have a conscious awareness of the inherent, united relationship with the divine? And I think this perhaps is the point of the entire story. Their eyes were open. It is a story of how Israel is waking up to the inherent oneness that's always been theirs. The question is not, are you in the family of God? Are you not? Are you saved? Are you lost? Are you in? Are you out? No. The question that I'm more interested in is, first of all, you are in. Let's answer that for you. Second is this: to what degree are you conscious of your own union with God? And that's why I come to church called Vinings Lake on Sundays. Because check it out. About Wednesday, I forget. Do you know what I'm saying? Some of you are like, Monday morning, 9 a.m. I forget. All we're doing in here, this may sound so silly to some of you, all we're doing in here is reminding each other of who we actually are. That's it. But I can't begin to tell you that has profound implications for how we live our lives all week. And so maybe the story is about unconscious oneness. Adam and Eve weren't really aware of it until all of a sudden you get conscious oneness. Okay, let's end it right here. This is a John Philip Newell quote. We'll end it here. We did great. 12:31, faster than I thought. Kids are going to be happy. This will be on the screen. We'll close it here. In the Celtic tradition, the Garden of Eden is not a place in space and time from which we are separated. It is the deepest dimension of our being from which we live in a type of exile. It is our place of origin, or the genesis in God. I love this. Listen to this. Eden is home. But we live far removed from it. And yet in the Genesis account, the garden is not destroyed. Rather, Adam and Eve become fugitives from the place of their deepest identity. It is a picture of humanity living in exile. The image of God is at the core of our being. And like the garden, it has not been destroyed. It may have become covered over or lost sight of, but it is at the beginning of who we are. And so, my friends, for some of you in here whom Eden has become covered over or you've lost sight of, I'd like to bring you back home. And now you look back and you realize, oh, the whole story about the children of Israel and how they went off to exile and then they came back home. Yeah. What is that about? Returning to who they've always been and who they always will be. They just had a moment of forgetting it. And so if you're in here and you've forgotten or you've never been told, I hope you understand. I believe the essence of the good news of the gospel, the entire narrative that we've been handed, comes down to you understanding this beautiful truth that you and God have always been one.